Good evening. For some of you, this will be your first time in St. John's College. I'm the principal, Tim Brooke. The college was founded in 1997 by the generous donations of the alumni of St. John's University in Shanghai, hence our name. We are not a denominational or religious college, but we are a college that honors its founders. We are particularly honored tonight on a number of scores, and this is going to be an evening of honoring those who have made it possible for the college to be here. I mention our original donors from Shanghai. They are not here this evening, but there are others who will speak to some of the legacies that we have as a college here at UBC. We are an international graduate college. 150 graduate students work here, eat here, sleep here, and think here. And we are pleased that we've been able to open up our community to all of you who have come tonight. We are here to honor a people and a person. The people we are here to honor are the Musqueam Nation, on whose unceded territory the College of St. John's currently stands. And we are here also to honor a person, the first principal of St. John's College, of whom you will hear more shortly. This lecture is being organized in his honor. We are also honored to have John Borrows speaking to us tonight, but a lot's going to happen before John ever comes up to the stage. And to get the evening going, I'm going to invite Larry Grant to come up. Larry is an elder of the Musqueam Nation, teaches Musqueam language here in the First Nations language program, and I'm personally honored that he has been willing to come tonight and to we welcome him, and he is here to welcome us. All right? Sorry, I'm too tall, yeah.
Thank you, Tim. ASEAN, CEM, Nasiaya, Ayaslat, Buenosquis, Tanijan, Humasquil, Stack, Buenasianas, Priapalano, Equaltimoto, Slab, Senasianas, Chris Helixtoch, Tequinos, Emis Netten, Chris Hui, Tanatomo, the sounds Tomo Chris from Musqueam. The sequence, Theatala, Satism to Natal, Theatala, High Chapel, Siapnashaya. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Larry Grant. Ayasluk is my Musqueam name. And my ancestors, Priapalanok and Coltimilto, they were here to greet the first Spanish ship and the first English ships to reach our shores. And they welcomed them. And as my ancestors did, I also would like to raise my hands and welcome to all of you here at the St. John's College at UBC on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Hunkaminam people. And to actually bring some relevance to it, many of our people are descendants from Priapalanok. Priapalanok is our renowned warrior in Musqueam history, in Coast Salish history. Priapalanok was a warrior that had a fortified house site right in the area of the Museum of Anthropology. There was also another little fort around the original wrecked beach. And he also had a home at Jericho, in the area of the yacht club, the sailing club. And he also had a home at the Capilano Indian Reserve in Squamish Territory. They call it Squamish Territory today. However, that in our oral history, it was the Hunkaminam village. And he's the one that, after a battle that happened here, just before colonization happened, went up into the Campbell River area to seek revenge, along with about 25 other canoes. And they went up there and took revenge on that community and brought home as many of the captives as they could. So Keapulana was credited with that as a war leader, as a warrior in our community. In our community, for all of you that are not fully aware of today, the main winter village is 8 kilometers in that direction, right where the Shaughnessy Golf Course is, that sits on the reserve lands that we occupy today. And our community has been there for 4,000 years. We're the same people that occupied the Delta, which Vancouver is a part of, after the last ice age. And that's at least 9,000 years ago. So we're the people that have been here all of that time. As our history tells us, we have always been here. There are no travel stories. There are no Russian words in our vocabulary. So I don't know, it may be a Scandinavian name, Bering, but there are no Scandinavian words in our vocabulary either. So it's interesting to know that our stories, how I remember them being told to me, is we are the people that have always been here. Our language continues from Stewaston in the south, where the ferry to Victoria goes, up to Point Atkinson, where the other set of ferries go to Nanaimo, across the North Shore, up Indian Arm, and along into Port Moody, up into Coquitlam, Catesy, Kwantlen, and then back down on the south shore of the Fraser River. And that was our language continuum. However, when colonization happened and the explorers found, is it Terra Nullius? They found Terra Nullius. They discovered it. They said, okay, you guys, there's one over here, one over there, one over there, one over there. You come over in this one corner. So after all of that area, control of that area, we are now in control of 200 hectares, which half the government leased out to Shaughnessy, and also made an agreement with the real estate company for us. The best deal, trust me, got a deal for you guys. This is it. You can't get anything better. We got a leasehold set of lands for you to control. The lease properties were going for something like $30,000 a year in total. Price of housing at the time was approximately $14,000 in the neighborhood. So we got $30,000 to run our business and create a housing program that we were desperately in need of. And today, even though we've won some court cases, and the reason why I'm talking about the lease lands, is Musqueam is the home of the Guerin case and the Sparrow case. The top 10 cases in the world to do with Aboriginal law. Out of those lease agreements that we negotiated, and the negotiation was, we have a deal for you, sign it. You don't need to know the particulars, but we got a deal for you. So out of that comes the Garen case, which when I was in New Zealand in 2007 on the Waitangi Treaty grounds, people talked about that down there. It assisted people like the Maori to wheel and deal and pull stuff out of their treaty that they couldn't do before because of the Garen case here in Musqueam. So that case has helped many, many Aboriginal communities around the world. And we come back from that and we get the Sparrow case. And the Sparrow case has to do with Aboriginal rights and title, and that's used around the world also. But coming out of that, we fall all the way back to Preoplano. The Musqueam people are the warriors at the mouth of the river. And the mouth of the river began at Hope. If you're familiar with that, it's about 100 miles upriver, 150 kilometers upriver. And the mouth gradually came down, and we're the warriors, always at the mouth of the river, protecting the resource of the territory, whether it was human resource or other resources. We were the ones. The warriors were always here at Musqueam. So out of Preoplano, the warrior that did battle, hand-to-hand combat, we come out and we have Garen that uses the system to our benefit. We're still warriors. We might be warrior wordsmiths, but we're warriors today, still fighting for the world. And as I stand here today, I go on because I'm standing here on unceded territory, and we're still working on that. And much of the world is not aware that this is unceded territory. And we're still struggling to pull that back into where there's an even playing field. And much of that is going to happen, maybe not in my lifetime, but in the lifetime of that little girl sitting there. It's one of my grandnieces, the daughter of my nephew. And it's just a little picture of who we are as a people. We utilize this whole area, this forest that they're trying to save for progress. Westbrook Mall is the example, is sitting at the headwaters of Tin Can Creek, one of the only creeks in Vancouver that has a native stock of salmon in it. Progress has covered the other 52 creeks with culverts, blacktop, garbage piles. Many of the neighborhoods in Vancouver are literally sitting on garbage piles. So that what we're sitting on today, the unceded territory of Hunt community people, that our community is still struggling. And I thank Dr. Stephen Troop for having a great vision and trying to indigenize the campus to bring more awareness to who are the original people of this land. So on behalf of, I'll leave it at that. I would also really like to raise my hands in thanks to St. John's College and the speaker series for recognizing the Hunkaminam people of this land. And with that, I raise my hands and thanks to all of you for being here. And this evening, coming from that story of Preoplano, have a little dance group that's going to replicate the story in what they're going to do. So I would now like to introduce the Musqueam Warriors that come out and do their song and dance. Hi, it's good. See you.
I want to give greetings to each of you, our respected friends, our family, to our elders, to the people involved in this great gathering this evening. We want to raise our hands on behalf of our family, the Musqueam Warriors. We're very pleased to join the celebration this evening. I want to honor Dr. Boros for the great work. Say bonjour and Anishinabek. Thanking you, Jimmy-Butch, to the fine work that is being achieved. Also want to extend our greetings to our friends from Saiwatan, the House of Learning here. Also commend you for the great work, each and every one of you coming together this evening. We are here with our children, our family, many of our elders that are supporting us, who have guided us. We want to share a small piece of our culture from the Musqueam people this evening. It's a sacred land to our peoples. It has sustained our peoples for innumerable generations. We will echo the rhythm of the land through our songs and through our language. The song we entered in was our canoe song. It's an ancient song handed down to us by our ancestors. We're now going to sing our welcome song, Again, to say Chimigwich to our Anishinabek brother, to our family here, and we will continue with our Stamia and our warrior song. Here. I'm very honored to share that welcome song as some of our native language. It says you are all good people. You come from a long lineage of good people. It's very important that we share some of our language, for it is on the brink of extinction. There's much work ahead of us, young people, following the guidance of our elders. We have been alienated, for the most part, from our lands and our territories and our resources, which greatly affected our way of life. Nonetheless, we persevere like people all around the world through tenacity and resilience. We are still here to showcase the resilience of our culture. We would like to now share some of our Musqueam aerobics with you, the Musqueam warrior song. Musqueam culture. Again, we want to recognize Alpha. Thank you for welcoming people to the territory. Thank you to each of our respected friends and relatives this evening. Again, we are the Musqueam Warriors, very proud to share the rich and ancient culture of our Musqueam people here in Skiwatan, Alps, and the name of this land, this pointed land. We're going to exit with the canoe song. As we entered in, we will be parting through the back of the room, and hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, the celebration. Thank you for having us here this evening. Again, on behalf of our children, on behalf of our family here, Nanu Ait, which follow it.
I've asked Larry to come back up here because I want to express our thanks to the Warriors through him. The college has never had an experience like this before, and I'm extremely grateful for you and the nation for coming tonight. Thank you. To honor this visit, and as well to honor Grant Ingram, of whom I will speak shortly, we decided that we needed to leave some kind of testimony behind. And so if any of you have gone into the social lounge, you know that we have a marvelous lithograph by Susan Point, who is a Musqueam artist. And we've acquired another piece of work by Susan Point, and I'm going to ask Larry to unveil it with me. But since I'm a little taller, I think I'll let you sort of receive it as it comes down. Well, we'll fix it later. Larry, thank you very much. This evening we are honoring the Musqueam Nation. We are also honoring Grant Ingram. Grant was the first principal of St. John's College, and this is the first annual Grant Ingram Lecture. We're delighted that John Burroughs has come to speak for the opening lecture in what we hope will be an ongoing series for a long time. Rather than have me speak about Grant, I knew Grant well, and he is sadly missed, but rather than have me speak about him, we've asked his wife, Helen Burt, to come and tell us some of her thoughts about Grant. Helen.
Thank you, Tim. Good evening, everyone, and special greetings to the members of the Musqueam Nation here tonight. Thank you for your marvelous performance. Thank you, Larry. I'm delighted to welcome you to this inaugural Grant Ingram Visiting Lecturer Program. I wear a few different hats at this university, but one of them is that I'm a senior faculty fellow of this college. And I recall my first visit to the college a number of years ago when I came as a guest for dinner and to listen to a talk given as part of a speaker program entitled Women in Science. My reaction to the college on the first visit can perhaps be summed up by my comments that I made to Grant at that time, which was something along the lines of, where was this place when I was a graduate student at UBC? I couldn't get over the warm, welcoming environment with its vibrant international culture, fantastic residents, great conversations, and the astounding food program, the meal program. I immediately went back to my faculty and started promoting St. John's College to my own graduate students. When I was asked to say a few words about Grant, my husband, I wondered what he would want me to say about him in the context of tonight's event. And I thought that he probably would have wanted me to get his career and his professional accomplishment stuff out of the way and talk about more interesting things. Grant was a physical oceanographer who worked in the Arctic for more than 35 years. In the early 1970s, he was studying sea ice, its formation, thickness, and variability in the Hudson Bay and in the Arctic Ocean. He monitored ocean temperatures. He worked with biological oceanographers to examine the relationships between physical processes and biological productivity. And he studied the fluctuations in Arctic sea ice at a time when this was not a fashionable subject. Then, just as his field was really starting to heat up, no pun intended, and the effects of global warming on polar ice caps were in every newspaper, every magazine, every journal. Unfortunately, he's not around to share in that spotlight, and I think he would have enjoyed that immensely. Grant also worked in the sub-Arctic regions around Great Whale and East Main rivers in northern Quebec, and he established long-term friendships and wonderful working relationships with some Cree and Inuit communities in these regions. As you know, Grant was the founding principal of St. John's College, and he came here from McGill in 1997 when the college was still under construction. He was a man who loved new ideas. He loved creating a vision and working with people to build innovative centres, programs, research teams, networks, and of course this wonderful college. I found a copy of a speech he made in July of 1999. And he gave this speech to a group of Johanians who, as Tim pointed out, are the alumni of St. John's University in Shanghai. In closing, I'd like to read you an excerpt of Grant's speech. The St. John's University motto of light and truth is a fitting inspiration for the new college. Ignorance is darkness. If knowledge and wisdom are light, they should be used to extinguish the darkness. However, the light of knowledge should be tempered with honesty, integrity, kindness, and generosity. I believe that's how Grant lived his life. Thank you, Dr. Burrows, for agreeing to come to be the first speaker in this first program. And I very much look forward to hearing your presentation tonight. Thank you.
President Stephen Toop wanted to be here tonight, but he is, I think, on another part of the globe. And so we've implored him to say something to you digitally. So if you'll have the patience, Stephen Toop will appear shortly on the screen.
John's Graduate College to speak at the inaugural Grant Ingram Lecture. I'm very sorry that I can't be with you in person. As UBC enters its second century as one of Canada's and indeed the world's finest institutions of higher learning, we are renewing and expanding our commitment to providing leadership in Aboriginal education, to better address the needs of Aboriginal and Indigenous communities in BC, Canada, and indeed the world. To this end, over the last 2 years, the University of British Columbia has been engaged in creating an Aboriginal strategic plan to help guide us. UBC acknowledges the location of its 2 main campuses on the traditional territories of the Musqueam and Okanagan peoples, and seeks to develop respectful and reciprocal relationships with all Aboriginal peoples in British Columbia, Canada, and around the world. UBC further acknowledges our essential responsibility to develop educational opportunities for Aboriginal people and to provide curricula and research that accurately represents and includes Aboriginal cultures, histories, and systems of knowledge, and which are relevant to Aboriginal communities and their concerns. UBC also acknowledges our responsibility to integrate these understandings in the education we offer to all students and to address the broader issues of ignorance and misunderstanding of Aboriginal cultures and histories that have resulted from the educational failures of the past. Finally, we recognize that progress in these areas requires that UBC must engage with First Nations and Aboriginal scholars and communities at all levels. And that's why I am particularly appreciative of Professor Burrows joining us here at UBC tonight. His accomplishments and leadership are renowned, and this is an exceptional opportunity to learn from his experience and his wisdom. Thank you for joining us.
Now I'm going to raise the microphone again because we're almost to the main event, but you have to be introduced to the main event, and Link Kessler is going to do that. And since Link is several inches taller than me, I think he's going to need all the microphone he can get. Link Kessler is the head of the First Nations House of Learning and a senior fellow of St. John's College, and we've asked him to introduce tonight's speaker. Link?
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity, and I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to introduce John. John is, I think, probably known to everyone here as a scholar and an Anishinabek intellectual, member of the Chippewa of the Nawash First Nation, and someone who has written works that many of us have relied on in our teaching and in our thinking and understanding Indigenous legal traditions, the relationship between oral and written presentations of legal systems, and the relationship of Indigenous traditions to Canadian law and to international law. And so he's a thinker and a scholar of wide influence and accomplishment. His book, Recovering Canada, The Resurgence of Indigenous Law, is a staple of curriculum and also something which has informed many people's thinking. And we were pleased to learn today over lunch that he has a couple of new books in press at the moment that we'll look forward to reading when they appear. And I think he'll be telling us a little bit about some aspects of those works in his talk. I could tell you more about reciting his accomplishments, but I think there's another side to John that I want to address really briefly before inviting him up to speak. And as I was listening to Helen describe Grant, who I did not have the chance to meet, I was thinking he would find a kindred spirit in John. Because I really have only met John a couple of times and probably spent the longest time with him today at lunch that I've had the opportunity to do yet. But I've heard about him for many years, and I've heard about him primarily from people who've worked with him and from students who have either been his students or have been at the same institution and benefited from the leadership and the mentorship which he has provided and the effect that he has had on the environment of those institutions. And that is a really significant accomplishment of a very different order. When we were talking about that today at lunch, there were a couple of pretty amusing ways of thinking about it. One of John's former students and a current student here was introducing herself, in effect, as a student of John's, and that was a routine part of her introduction. And someone suggested, yeah, they're putting it on their business cards. And I thought, well, there are probably print shops in Minneapolis right now where those business cards are being printed. And when you think about John's career and the fact that if we were not so fortunate to have the opportunity to spend a few hours with him tonight, our best chance for meeting him would come through hanging around in airports and taking lots of flights, because he moves around so much. He's been at so many institutions, and now is at a new position at the University of Minnesota. That he takes the time to have that kind of an effect on the people that he works with and the environment in which he operates is really, really, truly exceptional. And it's a very different kind of legacy and a different kind of contribution. And that's something I think that we have reason to celebrate every bit as much as his scholarship and intellectual achievement. The combination in one person is truly a rarity. And it's a real pleasure in so many respects to welcome him here tonight and to have a chance to hear what he has to say to us. So please, John, come and tell us.
I'm really grateful for the opportunity that I've been given to be able to be here this evening. I'm so grateful for that wonderful introduction by Larry, and to understand the relationships of this territory and the ancient possession and use and love that you have for this place. I can remember when I started teaching here in 1992 that my mother visited from our reserve back home in Ontario, and it was just as the House of Learning was opening, and she cried. And it was something I hadn't seen her do often in her life. But having gone through school where there were so many challenges as a young First Nations girl, a Ojibway, Anishinabek woman, to see the beauty here and the pride that you have in this territory, and to see this amazing house rise in the midst is just inspiring. And so this evening, with the dancing and the performance, I was brought back to that time when my mother felt that emotion, and I felt that emotion myself. And we're so fortunate to be here on this territory and to be able to be welcomed and to share in the beauty of this place. And I know there's more work to be done to recognize this place as a Musqueam territory, and I'm grateful for all you do to keep that alive. I'm also very grateful for the invitation from the college to be here this evening, from Henry and Tim and others. Had a really nice gathering over lunch, and so much of what we do in First Nations communities is often done through visiting over food. And I felt that as we were together as friends earlier today and then this evening around the reception and the meal. There's so much that we can take from nourishment with one another, and as we take food into us, we're reminded of the other kinds of nourishment we draw from one another, and I'm grateful for that. I'm also grateful to remember Grant and his great work and his legacy, and I'm pleased to be the beginning speaker in a series that will honor him. I've spent some time in the Arctic myself teaching Inuit students, and I know that there's much to love in that place, and I look forward to hearing more about this series and his name as it's honored through time. This evening I want to talk a little bit about my work in relationship to Indigenous law. Indigenous peoples do have law. We had law in the past, we have law today, and we will have law in the future. And that law is very important not only for Indigenous peoples but for the rest of Canada, because those laws contain principles, criteria, standards for judgment about how we should behave, about how we should respect one another, about how we should deal with people that aren't behaving in a respectful way. Those laws are so integral to our culture that we couldn't exist without them. And I want to talk about some of the reflections I've had about those laws. First of all, just by relating to you a little bit about their sources, and then giving you an example from Anishinabek law as to how I see these things unfolding in the present day. One of the things I learned growing up in Ontario, in and around the Cape Croker Indian Reservation, is that law can be learned in many ways. One of the ways we learn about law is hearing about the sacred around us. Sometimes the sacred is stories about the Creator and stories about beings around us that we don't quite understand and always are unable to make an immediate connection to, but nevertheless we learn about what our responsibilities are in relationship to the sacred. Sometimes the sacred is not necessarily the supernatural, but it's those respected teachings that are given reverence, that are given awe, that are given deference because of their time depth and because of the truth that's found in the experience of living in accordance with those teachings. So the sacred can be beyond our immediate physical understanding, but the sacred can also be within our physical understanding when we live in accordance with our best traditions. Traditions can be the dead faith of living people or the living faith of dead people. And when I look at many Indigenous traditions, I find that when they are the living faith of who we are today, of our ancestors that have passed on, they can sustain us, they can guide us. And so when I think about Indigenous law, one of the places I look to is the sacred. Another source, though, that I encounter in understanding Indigenous law is in relation to the natural world that lies around us. In some ways, it's a bit of an environmental law. A law is learned by reading the land, by seeing relationships that the birds might have with a particular site or tree, by seeing how an insect might interact with an animal, or seeing how a watershed functions in a particular area. And from that knowledge, analogies can be drawn across into human behavior, and that becomes a source of legal guidance. In other words, the land can be the legal archive. And when you have trusted teachers to help you interpret what's going on in the land, that can contain guidance for contemporary behavior. And so this can be a scientific method in one way of looking at the world. In another way of looking at the world, it's an experiential method of thinking about what are the standards, the criteria, the principles that we draw upon in making judgments about how we regulate our behavior, how we resolve disputes around us. Those are two very important sources of law. But then when I think about it more generally, I often recognize that sometimes the most proximate or immediate source of law is formed by deliberation, by people talking with one another, trying to persuade one another, reasoning with one another, drawing upon different ideas that allow us to develop some sense of consensus as to how we should proceed forward. And so as you look at law, you can see it often formed in a feast hall, as people will talk with one another in that setting, again across food, or in a circle setting, as people speak one at a time to be able to give their view of what the resolution of an issue might be, and then respectfully listen to those that follow and not interrupt those people until it comes back to you again. These ideas of deliberation being the proximate source or the immediate source of most Indigenous law means that our traditions can be living. Because in order to be persuasive in the present, it's not just talking about things as they once were, once upon a time, and how we lived and should live, but it's how we relate those teachings to the things that are surrounding us now, the land use development that you talked about on Westbrook Mall, or how we might incorporate concerns about gender or human rights or other things that are currently a part of our framework as contemporary Indigenous peoples. So persuasion is a conversation between the past and the present in trying to understand what the law can be at this moment. And so we'll think about the environment, we will think about the sacred, but we will communicate about that, and we see law formed in that way. Another source of law is also very familiar to those trained in the Western system. It's positivistic, meaning it's proclamations, rules, chronicles, sayings that have been encoded for some time, a list of do's and don'ts. In this place, this is what you should do. In this place, it would be a taboo if you did it in this way. And those kinds of rules and chronicles, codes, if you will, are sometimes found in songs, sometimes found in art, sometimes found in the language, encoded in the way that people will pattern their languages. And so you can find law within Indigenous communities by understanding many of those positivistic sources. A final source of law, although there are many more, but in terms of what I've identified, is customary law. Law that's developed by people interacting with one another through the ages to be able to create incentives to behave in a certain way and disincentives not to behave in another way. And these kinds of patterns are often sort of implied from the behavior or the relationships of people. They are found in the network of kin and association, and from that you find law is formed. And with that framework, I started to see that our laws are indeed living traditions. And though it's sometimes difficult to teach them in a law school setting, that's indeed what we've started to do, is to try to bring these more firmly to the attention not only of Indigenous peoples, but of Canadians more generally, so that they see this as a part of the law of this land. Musqueam law continues to operate in this space, and we saw today illustrations of that in terms of the caretaking and the teachings and the passing on of information about this site that had custom and deliberation and references the natural world around us, and there's sacred elements to it, etc. And part of our challenge is to recognize and unlock the richness of those sources, and also to recognize that there are some laws that Indigenous peoples have that shouldn't be followed in the present day. We, like all peoples, can improve. And as we improve, there are certain things we would discard, by the way, other things that we would pick up as a living people, trying to find the best of what is around us. So these two books that were being talked about earlier by that kind introduction that Link gave try to explore this issue. What is Indigenous law? What is Canadian law? One of the books is called Canada's Indigenous Constitution, and it's a pretty conventional law professor's linear exploration of what the law is and what can be done to harmonize Indigenous, recognize and harmonize Indigenous legal traditions with other legal traditions. That's one book. The other book is called Drawing Out Law, A Spirit's Guide. And that book is a series of 16 chapters that explores a young man's journey through the law in trying to understand these many ideas that I've just been sharing with you. And that's what I want to develop in the remaining time that's left, as one of the chapters from this forthcoming book, which deals with Windingos. If I could, I'd like to take you in your mind to my reserve on the shores of Georgian Bay in Ontario. We live on 2,000 acres, about 4 hours north of Toronto, 5 hours north of Detroit, on a place called the Bruce Peninsula. The Bruce Peninsula on the one side is very gentle as the waves have been washing against the shores for thousands of years. It's turned the western shores of the Bruce Peninsula into these beautiful sandy beaches that basically run from the tip of the Bruce Peninsula down into Port Huron in the south of the province. On the other side of the peninsula are all these dramatic limestone escarpments from 440 million years ago, when that area of Ontario was actually near the equator. And that area of Ontario was like the Great Barrier Reef is today. All of these corals were forming one upon the other. And so as you go down the other side of the Bruce Peninsula, you see all of these escarpments, just one after the other. The most famous formation of the escarpment, of course, is Niagara Falls, where the water falls over one of them into, eventually into Lake Erie. That goes up the spine of Ontario and finds home at Cape Croker, my reservation. So I'll take you there, and if you were there, you'd be on this 2,000 acres. You'd see the limestone escarpments in the background. You'd see about a mile width of beautiful plains covered in grasses and cedars and poplars, and then you'd come to a shore that would be about from here to the window that would be all covered in fossils, and you could pick them up and they're very flat, and you could see kelp and different small animals from that 440 million years ago. And into that place this book is set as a young man has a conversation with his grandmother and grandfather. And as they're talking, the old refrigerator fan whines in the background. And Comus checks the windowsills in her house. She sees that there's frost coating the panes on the inside. And in her sink, there's actually a skin of ice that's just covering the water in the glasses. The fire went out in this old stove last night, and it's allowed the winter to start seeping through the walls. It's getting more difficult to live there each year. Her house, you see, is slowly deteriorating. The upkeep is getting challenging. The cabin's southwest corner is gradually being undermined through accumulated years of natural subsidence, invasive cedar roots, and percolating water and ice. Time has a way of wearing most everything down, and the result is a noticeable tilt in her living room. Nokomis, the grandmother, had asked her son to backfill the crumbling foundation, and now, below her window, a steel shovel is pushing against crushed stones, signaling her son's work. And it's a comforting sound. She could always count on her boys for help. So she lit the propane stove to prepare him some tea while she enjoyed the sound of her son's memory of her. See, he was her oldest, a father of 6, and a general contractor on the peninsula. And he was known as a careful person. Living at the edge of the reserve in a big new house, he was taking his place in the community. He had built the house himself. It wasn't one of those Indian reserve specials. It had a basement with above-ground windows. It had a chalet-style roof that covered its generous bulk, its spacious rooms, and the project was almost complete. He just needed some spare time and a few more dollars to clad it in some new siding. He'd even placed the order at the building store. And as the rocks sang out their reburial, Nokomis was relieved to hear her son's work. He had been missing for 2 days. He had gone with his brother fishing, and they hadn't returned. Yesterday, all the men in the community launched their boats in search for him. The volunteers stayed out dangerously late, past dusk, eventually returning without any news. Later that evening, they patrolled the shores around the reserve with flashlights. Others scanned the horizon, looking for signals on the surrounding islands off the shore. It was well past midnight by the time the search parties returned to her house. They visited with her for about an hour or so, offering what comfort they could before eventually retiring for the night. Nokomis had finally fallen asleep around 3 o'clock in the morning, too tired to be able to fight sleep any longer. Now, hearing the sound outside her window, she was overcome with relief. Her son had returned. She knew that Lake Huron's waters were dangerous at this time of year. Mijibiju was at his most unforgiving. Many a boat had been lost in November's sudden, fierce gales. She also remembered there were more intimate tragedies associated with the water. The digging stopped, and Nokomis walked out to the porch to call her son. There was no answer. So she calls again and still receives no reply. She puts on her boots and walks outside, calling his name once more. There's no sound, just the wind. And for the first time she notices there's no car in the driveway. She looks over the ground. There's no footprints in the snow. Her heart starts to beat faster. She hurries around the corner to see the place that needed repair, and the stones lie in the hole unturned. There's just a skiff of snow covering the rocks. Everyone attended the funeral in the next couple of days. A day earlier, they had gathered at the old store at the Four Corners for the wake. Bear meat sandwiches were served, and many songs and stories were told, and people joked. There was some laughter, there were some tears. People spoke about the brothers' lives, and they reflected on their deaths. One of the bodies had been found along the shore, and the other was picked up by the Coast Guard, caught in the rocks just off the beach. It was actually Remembrance Day, November 11th. A few weeks later, the young man and his grandmother were sitting in her old kitchen cabin discussing these recent events. There was a picture of the two brothers on the table between them. Looking at their images, they both recalled the personalities that they had, their goals and their fears. They reminisced about their good times together. Nokomis spoke about her son's childhoods and the people they left behind, the young families. As the conversation drifted, eventually the subject turned to even deeper things. The young man asked his grandmother, "Nokomis, how do you get through all the pain and the challenges that you've faced in life? Tell me about the four hills of our people again. That last hill I'm particularly interested in. How do you get up it? We haven't spoken about that for ages." Nokomis looks back across the table and says, "Well, what do you want to know, grandson?" "Well, I'm thinking about what you taught me about the scrolls in the cave, the thunderbirds. From my dreams that I've had earlier, I'm remembering about this fourth hill. It was white. There was lots of snow. And there were few people at the top of that hill. Many of them actually grew frail the higher they rose. Some fell by the wayside. But there was the sound of joy there, standing in the sun at the pinnacle, as sweetgrass smoke rose from their smudge bowls. I sensed a purity in my dream about that scene, and I'm wondering what it takes to make it up that fourth hill." Nokomis looks back and smiles at her grandson. "That's a big question you're asking. Too big for words. I could get lost in trying to explain the whole answer to you." The man then takes the picture of his uncles in his hands as he ponders her response. He eventually sets it back on the table and asks, "Well, if it's hard to explain, how am I to learn about how to rise in this life?" Well, the answer to that depends partly on you, grandson. Each person has different gifts that they can use to reach their destination. There is uniqueness in every journey. Some of what it takes to reach that goal will only come through you. You need to discover and develop what is distinctly yours. Comus then laughs as she thinks about what she said. We sound like a couple of Hollywood Indians, full of stoicism and wisdom. Your grandfather would get a kick out of that. He spent many years becoming one in California. And then she laughs again. Anyway, she says, they can take many things away from us, but they can't take away our teachings. Even if your journey is your own, there are some general guides that have been passed down to us through the generations. Our dreams, our experiences, our stories teach us about the specifics. The scrolls, the songs express ideas from which everyone can learn. There's also wisdom from other cultures from which we can draw great strength and guidance from. These ideas can be used to judge how we should live. They contain criteria to evaluate our course of life. In fact, I think that's what you told us when you first recounted the dream. Do you remember? And then at that moment, the porch door opens and a blast of December wind fills the room. Wisps of snow flash across the floor before dying at the stove. Mishoma's grandfather rushes in, slamming the door behind him and locking out the storm. Unwrapping his scarf and shrugging off his coat, he drapes them on the hook over the wall in the corner. He sits down at the stool and pries off his boots. The snow's really getting heavy out there, he says. It's a real blizzard. You can hardly see the house. It's really whipping in off the lake. I'm sure we'll be buried by morning. Mishomas then stands and makes his way to the kitchen table. He sits down and pours himself a cup of tea. He wraps his fingers around its warmth. They talk of his trip back from town and the mounting storm. They discuss the latest forecast. Eventually the conversation fades into silence, and they listen to the blowing snow. After a few minutes, Mishomas turns to his grandson. So what are you writing about these days? Are you still trying to finish that book? Grandson responds, yeah, it's been pretty slow. Not sure if anyone will understand what I'm saying. When you try to write about law in Anishinabek terms, it doesn't come out the same way as you're taught in law school. I'm struggling to give some insight into our legal world without being completely confusing. I can't imagine what Professors Macklin, Slattery, or McNeil would think about what my work is saying. They did teach about innovative and creativity. I hope they see this as legal literature, but it does have a different feel. Shomas answers, well, you have had a lot of teachers, and I'm sure it's complicated to incorporate all that you've learned. Anyway, even if some of them don't understand, I think you should press on. It keeps our traditions alive and relevant when they interact with the world around them. Our legal perspectives would be lost if we didn't use them. I've always had a problem of trying to preserve traditions in their pristine form. You preserve jam. You live traditions. At that point, there's an interjection. That's true, says the grandparent, but we have to learn to be careful about how our traditions are expressed. You know, it can be a challenge to do it properly. We have to keep true to their spirit, even as they are transferred through the generations. Our traditions are abused when they aren't cross-referenced and woven together. Their meaning should be drawn from how they interact with one another. They should be wound tightly around their subject, not just scattered here and there. Since our ideas embody a worldview, they must interact with all parts of the world. Of course, some details change as they are applied in new situations. Your life is different from us, grandson. But there are some aspects that remain constant. Then turning to him again, she says, and I'd be interested to see if you succeed. And Mishomas looks at the man. I'm sure he'll do fine, as long as he doesn't quote us. Now, what are you writing about? Well, you see, I've already written about issues, individuals, and institutions. Now I'm writing about ideas, about how our laws need to re-emerge and infuse our issues, our lives, and our institutions. We need their guidance to chart our journeys. Nokomis and I were just discussing the dream I had about the hills. I was asking her how she felt about the pain of death. I can't imagine how you must feel right now. The climb looks so difficult from where I sit. There are so many obstacles. The path is so steep. Do you have any ideas, Mishomis? He thinks, well, there are no easy answers, but one thing you might consider writing about is healing. It's spoken about so often in our communities, and there's a reason for that. Deep laws are attached to that teaching. We have grand medicine societies that teach knowledge about healing, but these ideas also run through much of our society. You know, our family is of the Otter Totem. We have special responsibilities in our clan for healing because of that affiliation. Otter Totem is medicine totem. You have a responsibility to look at the laws and see where you can find healing. And I know it's a struggle for you, grandson, but I'm glad to see you're trying to live up to your duty. Now tell me, what have you learned about law and healing? The man ponders the question for some moments before responding. Well, there's a lot to say, Mishomis, but when you ask the question, my mind actually goes back to my childhood. When I was a boy, I remember exploring out back by our barn. Whenever you entered the barn, the birds would fly all over the place from rafter to rafter. They would throw dust into the shafts of light. I would spend days at a time there, finding all sorts of secret chambers in the hay. I found baby mice, newborn kittens, freshly hatched chicks, and 100 varieties of spiders and bugs. The place was full of magic as a young guy. But anyway, one day when I was about 10 years of age, I was exploring the old abandoned chicken coop on the second floor. It had 2 windows about 3 feet off the floor, and I wanted to see outside. So I jumped up to rest on my stomach, and as I did so, I could look out into the ravine and beyond the ravine into the forest beyond. My feet were dangling about a foot off the floor, and when I finished, I pushed myself back down off the windowsill, and I felt a sharp pain in my foot. A rusty nail pierced my old North Star running shoes. It went an inch into the center of my foot. It hurt so bad I could hardly stand, but there was no one around to be able to help. So I had to extract the nail from my foot, make my way back to the house, and then to add insult to injury, I remember going to the doctor and getting the biggest tetanus shot anyone had ever seen. Had difficulty walking for a few weeks, and that curbed my enthusiasm for the barn for some time. It actually wasn't until a few years later that I started going to the barn again. Here's how it happened. One day, when Mom was walking in the ravine, she came to one of those old white pine trees that grew on its slope. They tower over the land. And at the bottom was a fledgling red-tailed hawk that seemed to have fallen to the earth and damaged its wing. She approached it and it didn't resist, so she picked it up. She held it by the legs with the talons away from her body, and she cradled it in her arms. She then walked back to the barn and placed the injured bird in the empty chicken coop. She called the man from Natural Resources to come and see if he could do anything to help, but he was actually fairly pessimistic. He said its wing was broken and it would probably never fly. He said there was no place to care for such a bird, so we might as well just dispose of it. Well, Mom had no such intent, and she wanted to do what she could do to help. So she read about its dietary needs. She spoke to people she thought might know something about these birds. She fed it every day on cat food and water. And whenever you entered the coop, the hawk would just stare back at you. And when you left, you could spy through the cracks in the barn board doors and you could watch it hop over to its meal. As the months passed, it seemed to get stronger until one day it actually could fly to its food. It was awkward at first, but it eventually got the hang of it. And through time, you could see the bird getting better. With its health seemingly restored, we eventually made a plan to release it. We threw open the main barn doors, opened the chicken coop door, and placed some food to tempt it out. We left a trail of food to freedom, Hansel and Gretel style. So following the food, the hawk hopped out of the coop and seemed content for a while to sit amongst the bales. Its movements were tentative, so we started to make some noise, waving our arms and yelling for it to leave. Our action eventually shook its complacency, and it jumped to the door's threshold, looking over the barnyard and the ravine. But again, it seemed hesitant to leave. Something, though, must have eventually sparked its intuition. All at once, it jumped up, and it glided across the barnyard. It landed on an old hand pump near the well house, and then looked back towards the open barn door. Then, with a mighty force, it sprung into the air, beat its wings, and caught the currents. It rose higher and higher. It circled the barn, looking down on us below. It did this for about 5 to 10 minutes before heading out over the fields to complete freedom. I remember thinking how majestic it looked as it soared away. From that time forward, I had no fear of the barn, and it became a favorite place once again. And I think this experience helped me learn about healing, though I'm not sure I realized it at the time. A site that can be a place of pain does not always have to remain that way. It can be transformed through knowledge, care, and time. This experience has since become a significant reference point in my thoughts about healing. Anyways, I don't think much about what we teach in law school does a very good job of addressing Anishinabek notions of law and healing. And that's one of the reasons I'm writing this book. I think our practices and teachings can help partially remedy this deficiency. The Canadian legal system seems so oriented around material concerns. It's a large bureaucracy filled with professionals, paper, management, and delay. In criminal matters, it primarily apportions blame and guilt. In civil matters, its remedies are mainly monetary. It has many strengths, but the system has a hard time staying focused on people and their relationships. It needs an infusion of other ideas. There's a search for alternative processes. Maybe some of our systems, which are oriented around relationships, can provide some guidance. So to recover this focus, I believe the development of our laws and systems should once again be the mainstream of legal thought in our territories. We should resolve our disputes by judging them by these broader principles. And then Mishomis nods in agreement and adds, healing will expand when our people judge the lessons behind their experiences by these principles. And then he takes the picture in front of him and looks at his sons. Your story about the barn is a good one. We can be healed from our carelessness and wrongdoing. Knowledge and the right care and time are important prescriptions, but that's not enough. Sometimes we don't recognize when we're hurting ourselves or others. Heavens knows I haven't. You need good ideas as a reference point to help you realize the harm you're causing. Or you need someone like your mother around who knows the principles and the knowledge about how to use them. And the man interjects, I wish Canada would recognize all the harm they've caused our people. Maybe they would see the harm if they viewed things from our perspective. Their laws don't seem to acknowledge systemic harm. Canada's legal system can't seem to frame the issue in broad enough terms to provide relief. Well, your point's a good one, grandson, but we can't get caught up in constantly blaming others when they bring us pain. Healing has to move in two directions. On the one hand, when we cause harm, we need to restore what's taken to the extent that we can. On the other side, when someone has harmed us, balance is restored by getting on with our lives and not letting others' exercise of agency poison us. I'll always remember this example from a man in Arizona. He told me about this group of young people who went out one day to spend the day in the desert. They drove out of the city through the flatlands and into the canyons. They put on their hiking boots and set out across the harsh terrain. They had a great day enjoying the beauty of the land. Then they returned to their cars late in the evening and they prepared for their journey home. Just as they were about to leave, one of the girls stepped on a snake that had been sunning itself by a rock near the trunk, and it lashed out in defense, biting her ankle and sinking its venom deep into her leg. It took a moment for others to realize what had occurred, but when they did, they set out to try to destroy the snake. Their intent was good. They didn't want others to be harmed by it. They didn't want others to suffer the same pain. So they spent about 20 minutes looking for the snake, but it had disappeared. Then they remembered their friend who had been hurt, so they returned to help her. When they got to the car, her leg had started to swell, and she was becoming delirious. On the 2-hour journey back to the city, her condition rapidly deteriorated. Finally, they arrived at the hospital. She was taken into emergency and given all the assistance that she could be given, but it turns out she lived, but not all was well. She had to have her leg amputated just below the knee because there was no other way to stop the flow of venom from reaching her heart. The doctor said if she'd only arrived 20 minutes earlier, they probably would have been able to save the leg. Grandson looks back. I've heard you tell this story before, Mishomis. I always feel sad when you tell it. The time they spent searching for the snake was the amount of time they needed to save the leg. I can see what you mean about healing. Not only do we have to take action when we hurt others, we also have to take action so others don't unduly harm us, and we have to take that action as quickly as we can. We can poison our lives if we try to fight every injustice we encounter. We have to be wise. We have to choose when to strike back. No one can face every challenge alone. You have to leave some things alone so you can get on with your life. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not excusing injustice and harm. They have to be addressed. But you may not be the best person to address every harm that's faced. That's why we work together. That's why we have communities of relationships. Chances are there's someone out there that's willing and able to address the injustice. It's also why our communities need to become healthier so that we can pool our talents and pool our gifts. We all need to work together to restore action, to take action and restore relationship. And Nokomis perks up. That reminds me of something I read about in the band newsletter the other day. It's an old story from the 1830s. It actually happened in the Rainy River district on the other side of the bay. It relates to what you said about working together to take action and restore relations. Let me see if I can find it. So Nokomis stands and heads over to her desk. There's a laminated map of the world on the top of the desk so she can see where things are happening in the news. She opens below the drawers and rifles through the files, and she eventually pulls a few copies, photocopied papers out and says, "This is it. I knew it was in here somewhere." And then she sits back down at the table and passes the clipping to her grandson. "Read this. It's a story about a Windingo and how the people use their laws to deal with people who have been threatened as individuals or threatened the community. Windigos were people who went mad and took the lives of others. They could become cannibals. They're also a symbol of greed and consumption because they're continually hungry and they devour all around them, but they are never satisfied." I think your cousin Darlene found the story and passed it on to the newsletter. The man then takes the document in his hands and turns to the article, and he begins reading aloud. "Account given by Mayakaming of the murder of an idiot last winter by a band of Indians near the French River during the winter of 1838, recorded by Jarvis, Superintendent of Indian Affairs." It says, "He came among us at the very beginning of last winter, having in most severe weather walked 6 days without either kindling a fire or eating any food. During the most part of this winter, he was quiet enough, but as the sugar season approached, he got noisy and restless. He then went off to a lodge and there remained 10 days, frequently eating a whole deer at 2 sittings. After that, he went off to another lodge, when his great change became visible in his person. His form seems to have dilated, and his face became the color of death. At this lodge, he first exhibited the most decided professions of madness, and we all considered that he had become a Windingo. He did not sleep, but kept on walking around the lodge saying, "I shall soon have a fine feast." Soon this caused plenty of fears amongst both the old and the growing. He then tore open the veins at his wrist with his teeth and started to drink his blood. The next night was the same. He went out from the lodge and without an axe broke up many saplings about 9 inches in circumference. He never had any sleep but worked all that night, and in the morning brought in the poles he had broken off, and at 2 trips filled a large sugar camp. He continued to drink his blood. The Indians then all became alarmed, and we all started off to join our friends. The snow was deep and soft, and we sank deeply into it with our snowshoes. But he, without any shoes or stockings, barely left the indent of his toes along the surface. He was stark naked, tearing off all the clothes that we could give him as fast as we could put them on him. He continued drinking his blood and refused all food, eating nothing but ice or snow. It says here, we then formed a council to determine how to act, as we feared he would consume our children. It was unanimously agreed that he must die. His most intimate friend undertook to shoot him, not wishing any other hand to do it. And after his death, we burned the body, and all was consumed but the chest, which we examined and found to contain an immense lump of ice, which completely filled the cavity. The lad who carried into effect the determination of the council has given himself to the father of him who is no more, to hunt for him and fill all the duties of a son. And we have also all made the old man presents, and he is now perfectly satisfied. Finishes here by saying the deed was not done under the influence of whiskey. There was none there. It was the deliberate act of the tribe and council. When the man finishes reading the piece, he places the paper in front of him on the table. His grandmother asks, "So does that true story tell you something about our principles and how we use them to exercise our laws?" The man thinks for a moment and glances through the paper a few times. Then he begins, "Actually, this is quite exciting, Nokomis. Look at the problem they faced. The community had no other resources for their protection but themselves, their extended family and friends. The onset of their problem with the man was slow and gradual and developed over most of the winter. His health and mental state seems to have worsened as time went by until he began uttering threats. They tried to help him all through that period. And even after he started threatening, they did not take action right away, but seemed to wait 2 or 3 weeks to form some opinions. They exercised watchfulness and patience, despite the threat they were under and the harm the man was causing himself. When it finally became clear that he was not getting any better, rather than take action on their own, what did they do? It says here they went to council together. Their methods of making judgments were collective, not individualized. They relied upon one another's viewpoints. They obviously thought this was very important to do in this manner because they traveled through heavy snow to be able to meet together. And then when the group finally deliberated, notice what motivated the decision to kill the man. It was not retribution, it wasn't anger, it was defense, it even had compassion. The man's closest friend was charged with the duty. And then there's the restorative part of the action. The father received gifts from the community, and the man who killed the son stepped into his role. Imagine if judges or lawyers had to take the place of those they prosecuted or sent to jail. This shows how different Anishinabek law can be. And to top it all off, the man who lost his son seemed at least satisfied with the council's decision. As I think about this example, I think it's important to focus on the process and the principles that guided their actions, rather than to focus on the specific outcome. I am sure we would approach psychological illness very differently from our ancestors. However, we can take guidance from the underlying principles in this account. Because Windigos come in many different forms today. There are other types of cannibalistic consumption that destroy lands and destroy people. These principles could be applied to those problems. What do you think about Windigos and Nokomis? And at that very moment, a strong gust of wind rattles the windows and shakes them in their frame, and Nokomis looks around anxiously. She pulls her sweater more tightly around her neck, and then another blast rattles the windows, and she eventually gets up to test the latches. She takes a few towels from the drawers and places them under the windows as she walks around the room. Before she sits back down, she checks the fire, adds another log. As she settles at the table, Nkoma says, "I still think Windigos stalk the land. I have felt their presence over the last month. Sometimes it feels as if I am being frozen from the inside out. The pain is so hard to bear. I am grateful for our stories and ideas. They do help me climb that hill. They do help me move forward. But I understand blood running from wrists and a hunger that can never be filled. It's easy to sit here and philosophize about healing and talk about law and how our stories should guide our actions. But it actually has to go beyond words. It's more difficult than words alone. Now don't get me wrong, it's a very important thing you're trying to write about and understand. You should continue to write your book. It may do some good, as long as you remember that words are never sufficient to convey the complexity of our lives. You have to practice law. It has to be experienced. It has to be lived. How many people out there do you think will say that Windigos still stalk the land, even with your explanation, grandson? We can't dismiss Windigos lightly, but many will still doubt their existence. As Nokomis finishes speaking, the blizzard again redoubles its rage outside the small log cabin at the edge of the lake. Driving snow sticks to the window and pushes the door while the howling wind tears at the roof. Ice and snow slowly work their way further under the southwest corner of the house, further undermining its foundation. The world outside is chaotic. It is dangerous. But inside, the man and his grandparents are safe for the moment, protected by the stove's warmth and their stories. Hopefully from this you can see the approach that I'm trying to take by having these 5 different types of law be reflected in an Anishinabek legal narrative. Again, I'm appreciative of the invitation to be able to speak here this evening and to be able to honor this college grant, the Musqueam Miigwech. Thank you for this evening.
Thank you so much, Professor John Burrows. Thank you, Elder Larry Grant. Thank you for the Musqueam Warriors. It's fairly late, but Professor Burrows has agreed to take a couple questions. I'm going to keep it very short because he's also on East Coast time, and so this is very, very late for him. So perhaps 2 or 3 questions at the most. And you've got very quick. If not, we're going to... Okay, then we have one more thing to do before we close, and that is to thank Professor Burrows and to thank everybody for coming. This has been a very important occasion. I'm sorry, I forgot to explain who I am. I'm the Associate Principal, Henry Yu. I was born in Vancouver. I was very lucky to come here as an undergraduate, went away. My parents came from China, and my grandfather came from China, and my great-grandfather came from China to this place. And I think this is a unique community because more than half of our fellows are from outside Canada, from around the world. This place that we're gathered in is the dining hall. So normally you would see tables here and we would feast together each night. And it is a place where people from all kinds of different backgrounds come together, learn from each other, perhaps initially think that other people have very strange ways and they're weird. This is a word that came up at lunch quite often. We quite often don't understand people who come from very different backgrounds, but this is a unique community where we try to come to understand each other and hopefully leave here much more wise and much more understanding that there are many different ways to live in this world and that we need to respect others. And I really think tonight's a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to understand, with the help of Professor Burrows, a different way of thinking about law and healing and a way forward. And so I'd like to acknowledge that by giving as a gift this plate. You can have cake on it, or you can have cheese, but hopefully it's a memento of the night, and also a symbol of what it means to find nourishment, intellectual nourishment, as well as food and eating and breaking bread together. Thank you, John. We also have one to thank Elder Larry Grant for that wonderful welcome, and also I think a very important moment for St. John's Fellows, our graduate students, and also for our senior fellows and for all those who are part of St. John's International Community, for helping us understand where we are in the world and for placing us in a place that's beautiful. We all enjoy it. I know students go down to Wreck Beach and walk up the stairs to get exercise, but I think it's important to understand where we are and that we are on the unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Thank you, Larry. Thank you for coming tonight to the inaugural lecture. Thank you, Helen, for telling us about Grant, and thank you to all of you for coming and helping us celebrate and honor and hopefully start a new tradition. And we hope, too, that John is not too tired, that if you were to come up and speak to him informally, he'd hang out for a little bit before we go. But thank you again, and we hope to see you next year at the second Grant Ingram Lecture.